Deep in the humid cotton fields of Yazoo County, Mississippi, where the morning mist carries whispers of forgotten atrocities, documents from 1843 reveal a case so disturbing that it vanished from official records within months of its discovery. Colonel Thaddeus Beaumont, a Confederate plantation owner with military connections, established what neighbors described in hushed tones as breeding experiments, involving his own male offspring and enslaved women. The silence lasted over 180 years until archaeological excavations in 2024 uncovered hidden chambers beneath the plantation house containing encrypted ledgers that documented systematic programs of forced reproduction designed to create what Beaumont called superior laboring stock. The discovery has shattered the carefully constructed mythology surrounding one of Mississippi's most prominent antebellum families, revealing a legacy of calculated horror that survivors' descendants are only now beginning to comprehend. Before continuing, subscribe and activate the bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. Chapter 1. The Discovery. In March 2024, construction workers expanding the parking lot behind the Yazoo County Historical Museum struck something unexpected beneath the red Mississippi clay. What appeared to be old foundation stones turned out to be the sealed entrance to underground chambers that had been deliberately hidden for nearly 2 centuries. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a forensic archaeologist from the University of Mississippi, was called to investigate what would become the most disturbing archaeological discovery in the state's recorded history. The chambers contained more than just artifacts. Wrapped in oiled cloth and hidden behind false walls were ledgers written in a complex cipher, alongside iron shackles sized for children, medical instruments of unknown purpose, and, most chilling of all, detailed genealogical charts mapping forced breeding programs. The documents bore the seal of Colonel Thaddeus Beaumont, owner of Rosemont Plantation, and were dated between 1840 and 1847. Initial translation attempts of the encrypted entries proved challenging until historians discovered the cipher was based on military codes used by Confederate intelligence. What emerged from those yellowed pages painted a portrait of systematic sexual exploitation that defied even the brutal standards of antebellum slavery. The colonel, according to his own meticulous records, had implemented what he termed selective enhancement protocols, using his 3 adult sons as primary breeding males. The discovery sent shockwaves through the academic community. Dr. Mitchell recalled the moment she first deciphered Beaumont's breeding charts. These weren't just records of ownership transfers or cotton yields. These were detailed genetic tracking documents, mapping parentage across generations with the clinical precision of livestock management, but involving human beings. The implications were staggering, not just for the Beaumont family legacy, but for understanding the systematic nature of reproductive exploitation under slavery. Local authorities initially attempted to classify the find, citing concerns about community relations and historical sensitivity. However, descendants of enslaved families who had oral traditions about the Beaumont plantation demanded transparency. Mary Washington, whose great-great-grandmother Cassie had been enslaved at Rosemont, told investigators, "We always knew something terrible happened there. Our grandmother spoke of the breeding house, where women disappeared for months at a time. The preliminary forensic analysis revealed evidence of at least 47 individuals who had been subjected to the colonel's programs. Carbon dating of artifacts and cross-referencing with surviving plantation records confirmed the timeline. But the true scope of the horror was only beginning to emerge from those carefully encrypted ledgers. As word of the discovery spread through academic channels, researchers began connecting the Rosemont findings to similar cases across the antebellum South. The Beaumont documents represented the most detailed first-hand account of forced breeding programs ever discovered, providing unprecedented insight into practices that had long been dismissed as abolitionist propaganda or isolated incidents. The Colonel's own words, preserved in his meticulous handwriting, would prove to be the most damning evidence of all. His casual documentation of human suffering, catalogued with the same attention to detail as crop rotations or equipment maintenance, revealed the calculated nature of these crimes. The legacy of Rosemont Plantation was about to be rewritten, and the voices of those who suffered there would finally be heard. Chapter 2. The Plantation's Structure. Rosemont Plantation sprawled across 3,200 acres of prime Mississippi Delta farmland, established in 1823 when Colonel Thaddeus Beaumont inherited the property from his father's estate. By 1840, the plantation housed 247 enslaved individuals, making it one of the largest operations in Yazoo County. But unlike neighboring plantations focused solely on cotton production, Rosemont operated under what Beaumont termed dual agricultural purposes, a euphemism that would take on sinister meaning as investigators delved deeper into his records. The physical layout of the plantation reflected its dark purpose. The main house, an imposing Greek Revival structure with white columns and wraparound porches, sat elevated on a small hill overlooking the slave quarters. But unlike typical plantation layouts, Rosemont featured a series of isolated buildings that Beaumont's records referred to as breeding facilities. These structures, located in a secluded grove half a mile from the main quarters, housed what the Colonel called his selective reproduction program. Colonel Beaumont was no ordinary planter. A West Point graduate who served in the Mexican-American War, he brought military precision to every aspect of plantation operations. His three sons, Marcus, aged 24, Theodore, aged 22, and William, aged 20 in 1843, had been groomed from adolescence to assist in what family letters described as improving the quality of our labor force through selective breeding practices. The sons lived in separate quarters near the breeding facilities, maintaining detailed records of their assigned roles. The Colonel's personal correspondence, discovered among the encrypted documents, revealed his twisted ideology. In the letter to his brother dated October 1842, Beaumont wrote, "Traditional methods of acquiring prime field hands through purchase have become prohibitively expensive. By controlling reproduction using our own genetic material, we ensure both loyalty and superior physical characteristics in the next generation of laborers." The breeding facilities themselves were designed with clinical efficiency. Each building contained individual rooms with iron fixtures for restraints, medical examination areas, and what Beaumont's notes described as observation chambers, where the outcomes of forced pregnancies were monitored and documented. The Colonel maintained meticulous records of menstrual cycles, pregnancy progression, and birth outcomes, treating human reproduction with the same systematic approach he applied to livestock management. Enslaved women identified for the program were separated from the general population and housed in these isolated facilities. Beaumont's selection criteria, detailed in his breeding ledgers, focused on women between ages 16 and 28 who demonstrated superior physical constitution, intelligence indicators, and proven fertility. Once selected, these women were systematically paired with the Colonel's sons according to schedules designed to maximize pregnancy rates. The psychological control mechanisms were as calculated as the physical ones. Beaumont implemented what he called compliance incentives, allowing women who cooperated to see children from previous pregnancies, while those who resisted faced complete isolation. His notes coldly documented that emotional manipulation proves more effective than physical coercion in ensuring breeding compliance, as maternal instincts override resistance. And The colonel's military background influenced every aspect of the operation. Guards, recruited from poor white families in the area, maintained strict security around the breeding facilities. Communication between the women was forbidden, and any attempt to share information about the program resulted in severe punishment. Beaumont's records show he paid these guards premium wages for their silence and loyalty, creating a network of complicity that extended beyond the plantation boundaries. By 1845, the program had produced 23 children, all officially recorded as born to unknown fathers in county records. But Beaumont's private ledgers told a different story, tracking genetic characteristics and physical development with scientific precision. The colonel was systematically creating what he believed would be a superior generation of enslaved laborers, using his own bloodline as the foundation for this horrific experiment. Chapter 3. The Colonel's Sons. The discovery of personal journals belonging to Marcus, Theodore, and William Beaumont provided the most chilling insight into the psychological dynamics of the breeding program. These documents, found hidden in a false wall of the plantation house library, revealed how the colonel's sons were gradually indoctrinated into participating in their father's systematic sexual exploitation of enslaved women. The eldest son, Marcus, began his journal in 1841 at age 22, initially expressing reluctance that would evolve into enthusiastic participation within 2 years. Marcus Beaumont's early entries reflected the internal conflict of a young man raised in privilege but thrust into a role that challenged even the brutal norms of plantation society. "Father explains this as our duty to improve the quality of our property," he wrote in September 1841, "but the screaming from the breeding quarters haunts my sleep." However, by 1843, his entries had taken on a clinical tone, describing women by numbers rather than names, and documenting their responses to the program with detached scientific interest. The colonel employed sophisticated psychological manipulation to ensure his son's compliance and eventual enthusiasm for the program. Family correspondence revealed a system of rewards and punishments, designed to normalize their participation. Sons who met their breeding quotas received increased inheritance shares, European travel opportunities, and social advancement within Mississippi's planter elite. Those who showed reluctance faced financial restrictions and social isolation within the family structure. Theodore Beaumont's journal entries, beginning in 1842, demonstrated how quickly the normalization process could occur. Within months of joining the program, he was writing detailed analyses of which women produced superior offspring and advocating for expanding the operation to neighboring plantations. His October 1844 entry chillingly stated, "The success of our breeding program proves Father's theories correct. We are creating a more valuable and compliant labor force while satisfying natural masculine impulses." Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching us from and the exact time you're hearing this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. The youngest son, William, initially showed the strongest resistance to participating in the program. His 1843 journal entries detailed attempts to avoid his assigned duties and express sympathy for the enslaved women. "These are human souls, not breeding stock," he wrote in March 1843. However, family pressure and the threat of disinheritance eventually broke his resistance. By late 1844, his entries reflected complete acceptance of the program's objectives. The colonel's methodology for training his sons involved gradual exposure and systematic desensitization. Initially, they observed medical examinations and record-keeping procedures. Next, they assisted with selecting women for the program, learning to evaluate breeding potential based on physical characteristics and health indicators. Finally, they were assigned individual women with whom they were expected to produce children according to carefully planned schedules. Family dynamics within the Beaumont household became increasingly twisted as the program expanded. The colonel's wife, Elizabeth, initially objected to her son's participation, but was eventually coerced into managing the female aspects of the operation. Her letters to relatives in Virginia, intercepted and preserved in the family papers, revealed her growing complicity. The colonel assures me this arrangement benefits everyone involved, providing purpose for the Negro women while strengthening our family's financial position. The sons developed rivalries over who could produce the most pregnancies and whose offspring displayed the most desirable characteristics for plantation labor. Marcus's journal entries from 1845 boasted about his superior genetic contributions and detailed plans to expand the program using his younger brother's children as future breeding stock. The normalization was complete. The colonel's sons had become willing participants in their father's systematic exploitation. The psychological transformation documented in these journals illustrates how institutional evil can corrupt even those who initially resist. The Beaumont sons evolved from reluctant participants to enthusiastic advocates of forced breeding, demonstrating the power of systematic indoctrination combined with financial incentives and social pressure. Their personal writings provide unprecedented insight into how slavery's brutality extended beyond physical exploitation to the complete moral corruption of the enslaving class. Chapter 4. The Women's Stories. Hidden within the colonel's meticulous breeding records were fragments of the women's experiences, documented through a system of coded notations that tracked not just their pregnancies, but their resistance, compliance, and psychological deterioration. These clinical observations, cross-referenced with oral histories preserved in descendant families, begin to reconstruct the lived experiences of the 47 women who endured Beaumont's program between 1841 and 1847. Each entry in his ledgers represented a human being whose agency had been systematically destroyed. The selection process itself was traumatic and deliberate. Women were examined by a physician from Vicksburg who visited the plantation quarterly, ostensibly for general health maintenance, but actually to evaluate breeding suitability. Sarah, identified in the records only as Subject 7, was selected at age 17 after the birth of her first child, whom Beaumont's notes described as vigorous specimen, indicating strong reproductive capacity. She was immediately separated from her infant and moved to the isolated breeding facilities. The psychological manipulation employed against these women was as systematic as the physical exploitation. Beaumont's records detail how women who initially resisted were shown the improved living conditions of previous program participants who had complied. Those who produced multiple children were allowed limited contact with their offspring, while those who continued to resist faced complete isolation and reduced food rations. The colonel understood that maternal bonds could be weaponized more effectively than physical violence. Mary, listed as Subject 12, kept a secret diary written on scraps of paper hidden in her mattress. Fragments of this diary, discovered during the archaeological excavation, provide the only known first-hand account from inside the program. Her entries, written in barely legible script, describe the daily horror. They come every second day, like the sun rises. No amount of prayer makes it stop. The screaming from the other rooms echoes all night. We are not women here, only vessels. The program's impact extended beyond the immediate victims to the broader enslaved community at Rosemont. Women lived in constant fear of selection, while men faced the psychological torture of being unable to protect their wives, daughters, and sisters. Beaumont's records note several instances of suicide attempts among both male and female enslaved people who could not endure the system's psychological pressure. Guards were specifically instructed to maintain surveillance to prevent such property loss. The medical aspects of the program reveal the calculated nature of the exploitation. Regular examinations monitored pregnancy progression, and births were attended by a midwife whose payments appear in Beaumont's expense records. Infant mortality rates in the program were carefully tracked, with adjustments made to nutrition and prenatal care to maximize successful outcomes. The Colonel treated human reproduction with the same clinical attention typically reserved for livestock breeding. Resistance took many forms, despite the psychological and physical constraints. Some women attempted to terminate pregnancies using traditional remedies shared through whispered conversations. Others engaged in passive resistance by refusing to eat or care for themselves, forcing intervention to protect Beaumont's investment. The Colonel's notes reveal growing frustration with what he termed irrational non-compliance among women who continued to resist despite his incentive systems. The long-term psychological impact on survivors extended far beyond the program's end. Oral histories collected from descendant families describe grandmothers and great-grandmothers who never spoke about their experiences at Rosemont, who suffered nightmares for decades afterward, and who struggled to form normal relationships even after emancipation. The trauma was passed down through generations, creating lasting wounds in families who only recently learned the full truth about their ancestors' suffering. Perhaps most tragically, the children born from these forced relationships carried their own psychological burden. Neither fully accepted by the enslaved community due to their mixed heritage, nor recognized by their white fathers, they occupied a liminal space that complicated their identity formation. Some eventually learned the truth about their parentage, while others carried questions about their origins throughout their lives, never knowing they were products of systematic sexual exploitation. The women's stories, pieced together from fragments and coded references, represent more than historical documentation. They constitute testimony to human resilience in the face of unimaginable cruelty. Their experiences illuminate the gendered dimensions of slavery's violence and demonstrate how reproductive control served as a cornerstone of the institution's psychological and economic domination. Their voices, silenced for over 180 years, finally demand recognition and remembrance. Chapter 5. The Conspiracy of Silence. The breadth of complicity required to maintain Beaumont's breeding program extended far beyond the plantation's boundaries, involving local officials, medical professionals, neighboring planters, and even religious leaders who chose to ignore obvious signs of systematic abuse. Recently discovered correspondence between Colonel Beaumont and various community leaders reveals a network of silence that protected the operation for nearly 7 years, demonstrating how institutional power structures enabled even the most extreme forms of exploitation under slavery. Dr. Heinrich Müller, the Vicksburg physician who conducted quarterly examinations at Rosemont, maintained detailed medical records that were discovered in his family's papers donated to the Mississippi Department of Archives in 2023. These records, initially overlooked by researchers, contained coded references to selective breeding assessments and payments that significantly exceeded normal plantation medical fees. Muller's journal entries reveal his knowledge of the program's true nature while documenting his rationalization. The Colonel's agricultural experiments, while unorthodox, represent scientific progress in human husbandry. Local law enforcement played a crucial role in maintaining the conspiracy. Yazoo County Sheriff James Patterson received regular payments from Beaumont, officially recorded as security consulting fees, but actually compensation for ignoring reports from neighboring plantations about unusual activities at Rosemont. Patrol records show that complaints about screaming and disturbances from the breeding facilities were systematically dismissed or never officially documented, creating a protective barrier around Beaumont's operations. The role of neighboring planters in the conspiracy reveals how competitive economic pressures could overcome moral objections to systematic abuse. Several plantation owners, including prominent families whose descendants still live in Mississippi, engaged in what Beaumont's correspondents termed collaborative breeding arrangements. These agreements involved lending enslaved women to participate in Rosemont's program in exchange for access to Beaumont's improved stock and sharing of breeding techniques. Religious leaders who should have provided moral opposition instead offered theological justification for the program. Reverend Samuel Hutchins of the Yazoo Baptist Church maintained correspondence with Beaumont that framed forced breeding as fulfilling God's commandment to be fruitful and multiply while improving the lot of the African race through selective improvement. Church records show that Beaumont was a major financial contributor, and Hutchins performed marriage ceremonies that legitimized some forced pairings within the program. If this story has already gripped you, leave a like. It helps Sarah and Mary and the other women's story reach more people. The financial networks supporting the operation extended to banks and merchants throughout the Mississippi River Valley. Cotton factors in New Orleans, who handled Rosemont's crop sales, were aware of the plantation's unusually high natural increase rates among the enslaved population. Correspondence with the New Orleans firm of Henderson and Associates reveals knowledge of Beaumont's breeding innovations and discussions of implementing similar programs at other plantations in their network. Legal professionals played a particularly insidious role in legitimizing the program through careful manipulation of property law and birth records. Yazoo County Clerk William Thornton, who maintained birth and death records for the enslaved population, systematically falsified documentation to obscure the true parentage of children born in the breeding program. His personal papers, discovered in 2024, contain detailed instructions from Beaumont on how to record births to maintain operational security. The conspiracy extended to the state level through political connections that protected Beaumont from investigation. As a West Point graduate and Mexican War veteran, the colonel maintained relationships with Mississippi's political elite, including correspondence with Governor Albert Brown discussing innovations in agricultural labor management. These connections provided advance warning of any potential official scrutiny and ensured that complaints never reached investigative authorities. Perhaps most disturbing was the role of some enslaved people in maintaining the conspiracy through coercion and manipulation. Beaumont identified trusted individuals within the enslaved community who received privileges in exchange for reporting resistance or escape plans. These house informants, threatened with punishment of their families, became unwilling participants in policing their own community, creating divisions that prevented organized resistance to the breeding program. The breakdown of the conspiracy began in 1847, when Dr. Muller's assistant, troubled by what he had witnessed, contacted abolitionists in the North. However, before any investigation could begin, key records disappeared. Witnesses were relocated or died under suspicious circumstances, and the breeding facilities were hastily converted to standard slave quarters. The conspiracy's effectiveness in protecting itself demonstrates the institutional power of slavery to silence its own atrocities through networks of complicity and shared guilt. Chapter 6. The Children's Fate. By 1847, the Beaumont breeding program had produced 31 documented children, ranging in age from infants to 6 years old. These children, products of systematic sexual exploitation, faced a unique set of challenges within the plantation hierarchy. Colonel Beaumont's records reveal cold calculations about their future utility, treating his own biological offspring as valuable property whose mixed heritage made them both assets and complications in the plantation's social structure. The fate of these children illuminates another layer of the program's cruelty. The colonel maintained separate records for each child, tracking physical development, intelligence indicators, and behavioral characteristics with the same systematic attention he applied to their mothers. Children who displayed what he considered superior traits were marked for specialized training programs, while those deemed less valuable were relegated to standard field work. His notes reveal particular interest in children who showed leadership qualities or mechanical aptitude, viewing them as future overseers or skilled craftsmen who could increase plantation efficiency. The psychological impact on children born into the program was severe and complex. Many never knew their true parentage, while others gradually became aware of their mixed heritage and the circumstances of their birth. A few children, particularly those who physically resembled the Beaumont sons, were treated with subtle preference that created resentment within the enslaved community. These children occupied an ambiguous social position, neither fully accepted by the enslaved population nor acknowledged by their white relatives. Educational opportunities for these children followed Beaumont's eugenic theories about developing their potential utility. Selected children received basic literacy training, unusual for enslaved people, but always within the context of their future roles, serving the plantation's interests. The colonel's correspondence with his sons discusses plans to use these children as intelligent property who could supervise other enslaved workers and manage complex agricultural processes, maximizing their value to the operation. The emotional bonds between mothers and their children became another tool of control within the program. Women who cooperated with breeding requirements were allowed supervised visits with their previous children, while resistance resulted in complete separation. Beaumont's notes describe this as effective psychological leverage, recognizing that maternal love could be weaponized more efficiently than physical punishment. The artificial separation and reunion of families served the program's coercive purposes. As the children matured, some began to understand the nature of their birth and the ongoing exploitation of their mothers. Several instances documented in Beaumont's security records describe older children attempting to intervene in the breeding process or communicate with their mothers in the isolated facilities. These attempts were harshly punished, with children facing solitary confinement or assignment to particularly brutal work details designed to crush their resistance. The colonel's long-term planning for these children reveals the systematic nature of his exploitation. Children showing promise were designated for breeding roles themselves when they reached adolescence, with detailed genetic charts mapping future pairings designed to consolidate desired traits. The program was designed to be self-perpetuating, creating subsequent generations of enslaved people who would be both physically capable and psychologically conditioned for plantation labor. Some children faced the additional trauma of being sold away from Rosemont when their mixed heritage created complications. Beaumont's financial records show several sales of high-value mixed stock to plantations in Texas and Louisiana, where their parentage would be unknown and their fair complexions could be advantageous in certain work roles. These sales generated premium prices, but permanently severed children from any connection to their mothers or siblings. The end of the breeding program in 1847 did not end the children's suffering. As tensions over slavery intensified in the 1850s, their mixed heritage made them targets of increased scrutiny and violence. Some attempted to escape during the chaos of the Civil War, while others remained at Rosemont through emancipation, carrying the psychological scars of their origins into freedom. Their experiences illustrate how the breeding program's damage extended across generations. Post-war records suggest that few of these children ever learned the complete truth about their parentage or the systematic nature of the program that produced them. Some descendants carried family stories about special treatment or light-skinned ancestors without understanding the brutal context. Others struggled with identity questions that could never be fully answered, products of a system that had deliberately obscured their origins to protect their perpetrators from accountability. Chapter 7. The Unraveling. The beginning of the end for Beaumont's breeding program came not from external investigation, but from internal collapse, as the psychological strain of maintaining such systematic brutality began to tear apart the very networks that had protected it. By late 1846, cracks were appearing in the conspiracy of silence, as participants struggled with mounting evidence that even by slavery's brutal standards, the operations at Rosemont represented an unprecedented level of organized cruelty that some could no longer rationalize or ignore. Dr. Muller's assistant, Thomas Whitmore, had been documenting his growing concerns about the program in a personal diary discovered among his effects in 2024. His entries reveal a man increasingly tormented by what he witnessed during plantation visits. The systematic nature of these arrangements defies even the rationalization that these people are property. What occurs here is the deliberate cultivation of human suffering for profit. Whitmore's diary shows him researching abolitionists' contacts in the North as early as January 1847. The first external threat came from an unexpected source. Neighboring plantation owner Margaret Sinclair, widow of a prominent cotton planter who had initially participated in Beaumont's collaborative breeding arrangements. Her own diary, preserved in family papers, reveals growing horror at the program's escalation. What began as agricultural improvement has become something monstrous. The Colonel's sons speak of their activities with pride that chills my soul. I fear God's judgment on all who have remained silent. Internal resistance within the enslaved community at Rosemont was also growing more organized and dangerous to the program's continuation. Beaumont's security reports from early 1847 document several attempted escapes and what he termed coordinated non-compliance among women in the breeding facilities. The discovery of hidden communication networks between the isolated buildings revealed that despite all precautions, the women had found ways to organize resistance efforts. The Colonel's own family began to fracture under the psychological pressure of maintaining the program. His wife Elizabeth's letters to relatives became increasingly erratic, describing nightmares and expressing guilt about her complicity. Her sister in Virginia wrote back expressing concern. "Your letters fill me with dread about the activities at Rosemont. Perhaps it is time to reconsider these arrangements before they bring ruin upon your family name." The financial pressures of maintaining the program were also mounting. Payments to guards, medical professionals, and local officials were creating suspicious patterns in plantation accounts. The Colonel's correspondence with his cotton factors reveals concerns about unusual expenses that were becoming difficult to explain or justify. The program's profitability was being undermined by the costs of maintaining the extensive network of complicity required for its operation. The breaking point came in March 1847, when one of the enslaved women, identified in records only as Subject 23, died during childbirth in circumstances that even Dr. Muller could not rationalize as natural complications. His medical report, discovered in the recently excavated archives, describes evidence of physical trauma consistent with violent assault. This death created the first documented evidence that could not be explained away or covered up through the usual channels. Whitmore's decision to contact abolitionists was accelerated by this death. His diary entries from March 1847 show detailed planning for exposing the program. "I have compiled evidence sufficient to demonstrate the systematic nature of these crimes. The death of this woman represents murder, and I can no longer remain silent." However, before he could act on these plans, the conspiracy moved to protect itself through more direct means. The Colonel received advance warning of Whitmore's intentions through his network of informants and moved quickly to contain the threat. The breeding facilities were hastily dismantled, records were hidden or destroyed, and key participants were either relocated or silenced. Whitmore himself died in April 1847 in what was officially recorded as a riding accident. though circumstances documented in contemporary letters suggest a more sinister explanation for his convenient death. By summer 1847, the program had been officially terminated, though the colonel's private correspondence suggests he hoped to resume operations once the immediate danger passed. The enslaved women were relocated to standard quarters, though many continued to suffer psychological trauma from their experiences. The conspiracy of silence reformed around concealing what had occurred rather than protecting ongoing operations, beginning the process of historical erasure that would last over 175 years. Chapter 8. The Cover-Up. The systematic erasure of evidence regarding Beaumont's breeding program began immediately after its termination in 1847 and continued for decades, involving careful manipulation of historical records, strategic destruction of documentation, and the creation of alternative narratives designed to protect the reputations of all involved parties. This cover-up proved so effective that until the 2024 archaeological discovery, no official historical account mentioned the program's existence, demonstrating how thoroughly institutional power could rewrite history to protect its own interests. The first phase of the cover-up involved the physical destruction and concealment of evidence. Beaumont's personal papers showed detailed instructions to his sons about hiding documentation in the underground chambers that were sealed immediately after the program's end. Other records were burned in carefully planned fires that were disguised as accidents, including the convenient destruction of the breeding facility medical records in a supposed lightning strike in August 1847. Legal documentation was systematically altered to obscure the program's existence. County Clerk William Thornton worked with Beaumont to create retroactive explanations for the unusual birth patterns at Rosemont, fabricating marriage records and paternity documentation that provided alternative explanations for the mixed-race children. Birth certificates were backdated and modified to suggest conventional relationships rather than systematic exploitation. The creation of positive historical narratives about the Beaumont family became a coordinated effort involving local historians, newspaper editors, and civic leaders. Articles published in Mississippi newspapers during the 1850s portrayed Colonel Beaumont as a progressive planter who provided exceptional care for his enslaved population. These fabricated accounts emphasized his military service and civic contributions, while completely omitting any reference to the breeding program or its victims. Financial records were manipulated to hide the program's economic aspects. Payments to guards, medical professionals, and officials were reclassified as legitimate plantation expenses through creative accounting that made suspicious patterns disappear from official documentation. The Mississippi Department of Archives contains plantation ledgers from this period that show clear evidence of systematic alteration, with entries scraped away and rewritten to obscure their original purposes. The enslaved community at Rosemont was deliberately scattered after 1847 to prevent survivors from sharing their experiences or organizing testimony about what had occurred. Beaumont's correspondence reveals strategic sales and transfers of individuals who had been most directly involved in the program, ensuring they were isolated from each other and from anyone who might document their accounts. This diaspora made it nearly impossible for future investigators to reconstruct the program's scope. Intimidation and violence were used against anyone who threatened to expose the truth about Rosemont's operations. The suspicious death of Dr. Whitmore was followed by similar accidents involving other potential witnesses, including a guard who had expressed reservations about his role and an enslaved man who had attempted to organize resistance. These deaths sent clear messages about the consequences of threatening the conspiracy's security. The Civil War provided additional cover for the destruction of evidence, as military actions across Mississippi created opportunities for convenient war losses of documentation that might have revealed the program's existence. Beaumont's wartime correspondence shows him using Confederate military activities as justification for destroying remaining records, claiming they were necessary security measures to prevent Union forces from obtaining sensitive information about plantation operations. Post-war Reconstruction politics created incentives for all parties to maintain silence about antebellum atrocities. Northern investigators focused on contemporary abuses rather than historical crimes, while Southern communities closed ranks to protect prominent families from scrutiny. The Beaumont family's wealth and political connections ensured they faced no consequences for their wartime activities, let alone accountability for pre-war crimes that had been successfully erased from official records. The final phase of the cover-up involved the creation of sanitized family histories that portrayed the Beaumonts as typical Southern gentlemen who treated their enslaved population with paternalistic benevolence. These fabricated narratives became embedded in local historical societies, genealogical records, and eventually academic histories of antebellum Mississippi. The success of this historical manipulation demonstrates how completely institutional power could control historical memory when motivated to protect its interests. The cover-up proved so effective that even during the Civil Rights era, when many aspects of slavery's brutality were being re-examined and documented, no evidence of the Beaumont program surfaced. The conspiracy's success in erasing this history meant that the voices of 47 women and their children were silenced for over 175 years, their suffering denied recognition until archaeological accident finally brought their stories to light in 2024. Chapter 9. The Reckoning. The 2024 discovery of the Beaumont breeding program documentation has forced a complete re-evaluation of antebellum slavery's systematic nature and the extent to which sexual exploitation was integrated into the economic foundations of plantation agriculture. As forensic archaeologists continue excavating the sealed chambers at Rosemont, each new finding adds another layer to understanding how thoroughly organized these crimes were and how effectively they were erased from historical memory until physical evidence could no longer be denied or destroyed. The impact on descendant communities has been profound and complex. DNA analysis conducted by the University of Mississippi has confirmed genetic connections between dozens of African American families across the South and the Beaumont bloodline, providing scientific evidence for oral traditions that had been preserved for generations. Mary Washington, whose great-great-grandmother survived the breeding program, expressed mixed emotions about the confirmation. "We always knew something terrible happened, but having it proven makes the trauma feel fresh again, even after all these years." Legal implications of the discovery have raised unprecedented questions about historical accountability and reparations for systematic crimes that were successfully concealed for over a century. Civil rights attorneys have argued that the deliberate destruction of evidence and creation of false historical narratives represent a continuing conspiracy that extends liability beyond the original perpetrators. However, establishing legal standing for crimes committed in the 1840s presents challenges that courts are still attempting to address. The academic community has been forced to confront its own complicity in perpetuating sanitized narratives about antebellum slavery. The Beaumont case demonstrates how thoroughly historical records can be manipulated when institutional power is motivated to conceal systematic atrocities. Historians are now re-examining other plantation archives with increased skepticism, recognizing that absence of evidence for breeding programs may reflect successful cover-ups rather than the program's non-existence. Religious institutions that participated in the original conspiracy have been confronted with documentation of their historical complicity. The Yazoo Baptist Church, where Reverend Hutchins provided theological justification for forced breeding, has issued formal apologies and established scholarships for descendants of Rosemont's enslaved population. However, many community members argue that institutional acknowledgement cannot address the spiritual trauma inflicted by religious leaders who perverted Christian doctrine to justify systematic sexual violence. Subscribe to the channel to learn about more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the case of Colonel Beaumont and Rosemont Plantation. We'll see you in the next video. The medical profession has also been forced to examine its historical role in facilitating systematic abuse through the documentation of Dr. Mueller's participation. Medical ethics boards have used the Beaumont case as an example of how professional authority can be corrupted when economic incentives override moral obligations. Contemporary discussions of informed consent and patient advocacy now reference the Rosemont documentation as a cautionary example of medical complicity in human rights violations. Efforts to memorialize the victims of the breeding program have sparked controversy within Mississippi communities that are still grappling with the implications of the discovery. Proposals for historical markers and educational programs have faced resistance from some residents who argue that focusing on historical atrocities damages contemporary race relations. However, descendant families and civil rights organizations have insisted that acknowledgement of these crimes is necessary for genuine reconciliation and healing. The international implications of the discovery have drawn attention from human rights organizations studying systematic sexual violence and its long-term impacts on communities. The Beaumont documentation provides rare, first-hand evidence of how reproductive control was used as a tool of genocide and economic exploitation, offering insights relevant to understanding contemporary crimes against humanity involving forced breeding and sexual slavery. As investigations continue, researchers are working to identify and honor all victims of the Beaumont program whose names and stories were deliberately erased from historical records. The process of reconstruction is painstaking, involving archaeological analysis, genetic testing, oral history collection, and careful interpretation of coded references in surviving documentation. Each recovered identity represents a small victory against the systematic erasure that protected these crimes for over 175 years. The Rosemont discovery has ultimately demonstrated that historical truth, no matter how deeply buried or systematically concealed, can eventually emerge through the persistence of evidence and the determination of communities to reclaim their silenced stories. The voices of 47 women and their children, denied recognition for nearly 2 centuries, finally demand acknowledgement of their suffering and resistance. Their testimony challenges comfortable narratives about the past while illuminating the ongoing work required to address historical injustices that continue to shape contemporary society.